Thank you all for joining us. I'm Matthew Silverman, the director of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our conversation today with Katherine Stewart and Rachel Lazar, who will be discussing Christian nationalism today. We've had over 1,000 registrations, our largest audience ever. This overwhelming response underscores just how vital our conversation is, especially given the growing influence of Christian nationalism in today's political landscape. Understanding and addressing this movement is essential to preserving our democratic values, religious freedom, and social cohesion in an increasingly polarized world. Thank you to Rhoda Ritzenberg and Ken Heitner and Irene and Dick Spiro, our generous program sponsors, for helping bring this to our community. We also extend our gratitude to Andrew R. Ammerman for sponsoring our Spring 2025 lecture series. Andrew dedicates this semester's learning in loving memory of Josephine and H. Max Ammerman and Stephen C. Ammerman. To those of you who have donated to the Haberman Institute, thank you. Your generosity makes it possible for us to offer meaningful lectures free of charge. If you haven't yet contributed, we encourage you to consider donating after the program. Every gift of any size helps sustain our mission. Please submit your questions via the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. Kindly keep them as concise as possible and in complete sentences. We'll address them at the end of the lecture, though you can submit them at any point during the presentation. I also want to let you know this lecture is being recorded and will be available on our website. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Rachel Lazar is the president and CEO of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. As a lawyer, advocate, and strategist, she has dedicated her career to making our country more inclusive. As a thought leader and freedom fighter, Rachel has written op-eds for major publications, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, and appeared on high-profile media outlets, including MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, PBS NewsHour, CNBC, and ABC News. Before joining Americans United, Rachel built bridges between disparate groups on a host of issues that connect to church-state separation. As the deputy director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, Rachel ran interfaith campaigns on LGBTQ+ equality, immigration reform, gun violence prevention, and paid sick, family, and medical leave. And on to Katherine Stewart, who has covered the intersection of faith and politics for over 15 years. Her most recent book, Money, Lies, and God: Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy, has been praised by Congressman Jamie Raskin as, quote, an indispensable citizen's guide to the anti-democratic MAGA right in America. Her last book, The Power Worshippers: Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, was voted first place for excellence in nonfiction books by the Religion News Association, among other awards, and forms the basis of the documentary film God and Country, produced by Rob Reiner. Stewart's work has also appeared in the New York Times, New Republic, Religion News Service, and many others. So with that, I now welcome Rachel and Katherine to join me as we explore Christian nationalism today. So thank you both for joining us. So first, Katherine, your new book, Money, Lies, and God: Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy. Can you give me or give us your elevator pitch of what it's all about?
Sure, thank you. I want to thank you so much, Matt. I want to thank everybody at the Haberman Institute, all of you joining in today, and of course, Rachel. It's always great to be in conversation with you. So I titled my book Money, Lies, and God because first, money is a really critical factor in the rise of the anti-democratic movement. Behind the movement's propaganda operations and the culture wars that drive it, there's really a giant wave of cash from a sector of extremely wealthy people, individuals, as well as foundations, and they've poured billions of dollars into the different features of this movement over decades. It's also important to note that huge concentrations of wealth at the very top of the economic ladder have destabilized the political system in some pretty interesting and not always obvious ways, and led to grievances among a sector of the rank and file. And leaders of the anti-democratic movement are really good at weaponizing those grievances for anti-democratic purposes. So second, lies or conscious disinformation is another huge feature of this movement. Movement leaders work very hard to separate the rank and file from the facts, from rational discourse, because that makes them easier to control. It makes our society, frankly, less governable. And that clears the way for a kind of strongman to take over and say, I alone can fix it. And then number three, God, because the most important ideological framework for the largest part of this movement is religious nationalism or Christian nationalism. Now, Christian nationalism and the culture wars that it feeds are what motivate a lot of the rank and file of the movement to vote for anti-democratic candidates. Many of these rank and file might not themselves identify as Christian nationalists, but with their actions and with their votes, they're lending support to a Christian nationalist agenda. And they also show, to conclude, that this rank and file has to be distinguished from the leaders. This is a leadership-driven movement and an organization-driven movement. And they're the ones who are really setting the agenda.
Thank you. So, Rachel, you're the president and CEO of Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, and Katherine's a member of the Board of Trustees. Can you give us a brief overview of what Americans United is all about?
Yep. Yeah, I'd love to. That's a softball, Matt. And great to be with you and everyone from the Haberman Institute and who's joining us tonight. And Katherine, thanks so much for the invitation to join you tonight. It's always really fun. Americans United for Separation of Church and State. We have been around for nearly 80 years. We are a historic organization. We are the only secular organization that works 24/7 entirely on protecting the separation of church and state. And, you know, Matt, in a little bit, I'd be happy to talk about why I still usually say church and state instead of religion and government. We were founded, this is sort of a little known fact, that we were founded by a group of religious leaders, primarily from my hometown of Chicago 78 years ago. They were primarily Methodist ministers, the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, Seventh-day Adventists, seminary deans, and public school advocates, actually. And in our manifesto, when we were announced on the front page of the New York Times, our manifesto actually includes protection of public education as one of our mandates that we're obviously fighting very hard on today. I am the first female and the first non-Christian president of the organization. And at 78 years, I'm the first Jewish leader, which is another interesting thing that we can talk about. You know, when they hired me, you know, I was like, Jewish, right? I'm Jewish. Okay, so we have that established. And then it was like, well, just so you know, if you hire me, I will also be surrounding myself with many Christian clergy a lot of the time, which I have. And there's no one more than Jews who says, I hope there's a lot of Christians working on this cause. And I'll finally just say about Americans United what we do, which is every day we bring together religious and non-religious Americans. And we fight in the courts, Congress, across state legislatures, of course, and publicly in the public square. And there's a lot of ways of saying what we fight for. One of them is we fight for everyone's freedom to believe as they choose, so long as they don't harm others. That's the first way. The second way is we fight for everyone's freedom to live as their authentic selves and to believe as they choose, because that illuminates the reality that your reproductive freedom, your freedom to be an LGBTQ person, all of those things rely on the separation of church and state. And the third way I describe what we do is to say that we fight for freedom without favor and equality without exception, because it turns out that church-state separation is what undergirds not just religious freedom, but religious freedom for all of us, right? And that's a lot of where the debate is taking place today. Is religious freedom just mostly for some of us, or do all of us have equal protections from religious freedom? And I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. Yes, it sounds like all very, very important work. So let's now move on to Christian nationalism. Some people hear that phrase and they think you're talking about and criticizing Christianity specifically. So how do you define, I'm sorry, this question is for both of you. It's open to both of you. How do you find Christian nationalism, and how would you distinguish it from the religion?
Well,
Katherine, you go first.
thank you so much. Well, Christian nationalism is not a religion. It's an pardon me, it's an anti-democratic political ideology that exploits religion for politics and power. And it's also a political movement, a leadership-driven, organization-driven political movement. Now, the religious right's influence in American politics and its dominant role in the Republican Party today is really a consequence of decades of investment in that deep organizational infrastructure. So it's not merely the idea of America as a Christian theocracy. The strength of this movement is in that infrastructure, much of which functions as a giant voter turnout machine in election cycles. And we can group the organizations that are sort of involved in the infrastructure into different categories. There are right-wing policy groups, networking organizations, think tanks, and a vast far-right, I would say, legal advocacy ecosystem. There are data initiatives, very sophisticated data initiatives. And then, of course, there's an information sphere or a propaganda sphere that spreads a lot of the messaging through the rank and file. A key feature of the movement is the pastor networks that mobilize tens of thousands of conservative or conservative-leaning pastors to turn out many, many millions of voters for far-right candidates. These pastor networks have groups like Watchmen on the Wall or Faith Wins, and they draw pastors into gatherings. Sometimes I've been to a number of these gatherings, sometimes dozens or even hundreds of these pastors. They give them very sophisticated tools and messaging materials to turn out their congregations to vote for the candidate who represents biblical values. And when we're talking about biblical values, think those, abortion, think same-sex marriage, don't think Sermon on the Mount or things like that. So I think it's really important also to note the way that Christian nationalism is anti-democratic. It takes the view that because America is a supposedly Christian nation, as they define Christianity, of course, any party or leader who isn't Christian in the supposedly correct way, or who fails to conform to their agenda, is illegitimate, because they say legitimacy derives not from elections or from any democratic principles or processes, but from representing an alleged fidelity to their version of the American past and what they believe is the will of God.
I couldn't do better than that definition. I'll add just a few things. So one of them is that I believe it's 84%, according to PRRI, of Christian nationalist adherents believe that America is a God-ordained nation for European Christians. So there is a white supremacy element to Christian nationalism, and it's complex. And I think, we can talk more about that too. But that aspect of Christian nationalism is there, as is a sexist aspect of Christian nationalism and a misogynistic element to it as well from that same poll. Really, the question of whether it's Christianity is a great one. And usually I give just the plain and simple answer that it's not, because that's, for one, what all of the many Christians who I work with tell me, And two, I agree with Katherine that it's a political ideology and a cultural construct meant to maintain traditional power structures in our society. The only place where I might slightly disagree with myself that it's not Christianity, and it's certainly not, I think this is really important. It's not everyone's Christianity, and it's not even most Christians' Christianity. But the weird thing is, it has infused some of the theology of certain strands of Christianity. So, Katherine has done such great work exposing the reality that in 1973, when Roe v. Wade came down, the Baptists celebrated the decision. The Baptist press has an article celebrating and lauding Roe v. Wade as a victory for religious liberty. Okay. But by the late 70s, they had changed their tune. And all of the sudden, they were adopting resolutions for their denomination that were anti-abortion, right? So just like when I worked at the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, I was the staffer for the resolutions committee for the Union for Reform Judaism. And, we'd go in and that's how we made policy for our religion. And so what I'm trying to say is, and we can, there's a very interesting story, obviously, that Katherine would love to tell you, and I could too, about why they changed their theology, which is rooted in white supremacy. But the reality is that there are folks in the rank and file of certain denominations of Christian. I think it's so important, especially for Jews, but for actually all of us who talk about Christian nationalism and church-state separation, to really distinguish different kinds of Christians and not lump everyone together, because there is a surging Christian movement of opposition against Christian nationalism right now, thank God, and they're doing God's work, and it's really important. And the last thing we want to do is alienate these folk. But I did just want to say that though it's rooted in a political agenda, there is an element of a certain breed of Christianity that has become infused with this belief system, unfortunately.
Thank you. Yeah. And so with that in mind, I'll ask in a couple of parts, but why do, I guess the first part is why is it fair to call it Christian nationalism if it's only a section of Christianity that supports it? But also there's people, some being Jews and other non-Christians, who are part of the movement. So what are your thoughts on that being the aspect, or why it's called Christian nationalism?
Thanks for the question. I use the term, I sometimes describe it as religious nationalism, and to make clear its similarities with other forms of religious nationalism around the world. So when leaders like Vladimir Putin in Russia or Erdogan in Turkey, or leaders in Iran, when these leaders bind themselves very tightly to ultra-conservative religious figures in their own countries in order to consolidate authoritarian forms of political power, we recognize that as a form of religious nationalism. And they're doing it not necessarily to create a pure theocracy, although their countries, depending on sort of the place, may have more or less theocratic features. They're doing it to create a kind of cronyistic kleptocracy, kleptocratic authoritarianism with theocratic features. And it points to the fact that I think, and listen, leaders of this movement embrace the term Christian. They call themselves Christians. And frankly, we all know that religion is incredibly diverse. We know Christianity is incredibly diverse in the way it's practiced and understood. But, I've, spent a lot of time in these places, and I've seen the leaders in the rank and file worship with as much sincerity as and devotion as anyone else. But I think, when we're talking about Christian nationalism, putting those two words together, it's in some ways a political process or even a pathology. So it doesn't even necessarily involve a consistent set of beliefs. like authoritarianism, I think it's better understood as something that happens to a political system rather than something that starts off as a full-fledged political program that receives majority support, or that the administration that's trying to implement that form of religious nationalism will sort of advertise it as.
And Matt, if I could, I'll just add to that. Agree with everything that Katherine just said, and also and at times I call it religious extremism because that poll tests really well. Like no one likes religious extremism. There's no confusion there. Unfortunately, though, ultra conservative Christians that are part of the Christian nationalist movement also think that they're opposed to religious extremism. And unfortunately, they're often playing into like anti-Muslim bigotry and terrible things like that. So you have to be a little careful when you use the term, but it's also a really powerful way to describe it. But and for a while, I've actually written columns about how it can feel, for lack of a better way of putting it, unsafe when you're Jewish to call it Christian nationalism, because we need Christian allies in this country. We are 2% of the population. I know I don't need to tell anyone here. And it's really important to have Christian allies. And the last thing that we want to do is alienate them. At the same time, I think it was Dr. King who said something like the day we stop speaking the truth is the day we begin to die. And the reality is those who are pushing religion on the state and using the machinery of the state to impose religion are almost entirely, those in positions of power, almost entirely Christians who are of the persuasion that America was created as a Christian country and that our laws and policies should continue to perpetuate that privilege for Christians. And just one example is the St. Isidore case that just went to the Supreme Court. And thank goodness, again, the Supreme Court deadlocked because Amy Coney Barrett really did the right thing to recuse herself, because presumably she didn't explain herself, but she was, from the Notre Dame Religious Liberty Clinic that represented the school before the court. So she recused herself, but, and therefore the nation's first religious public school is not to be for now, right? But the thing of that's a Catholic school that was given the status of a charter school in Oklahoma, and charter schools are public schools, fully funded, directly funded, setting a precedent for public religious schools. So back to your question, Matt. So there was a Jewish charter school operator out of Florida who said, this is great. Like, this isn't just for Christians. Like Jews could really benefit from this. And the Jewish Telegraphic Agency reported that he took a trip to Oklahoma and he saw how few Jews there were there, and he took it back and he said, there's too few Jews here realistically to start a Jewish charter school. Here's another, just one more example. At Americans United, we bring a lot of lawsuits, right? We have one challenging Louisiana's 10 Commandments mandate. We have two in Oklahoma, one challenging St. Isidore ourselves and another one challenging the Bible mandate there, right? We bring lawsuits. Another one of our lawsuits is on behalf of a Jewish couple from Tennessee. Their names are Gabe and Liz Rutenram, a lovely couple in their young 30s who have the biggest hearts almost of anyone I've ever known personally. And they wanted to adopt a special needs little boy. Went to their local taxpayer-funded foster care agency in Tennessee and were turned away for no other reason than that they're Jewish. Right. And that's because Tennessee passed a law allowing this type of religious discrimination in taxpayer funded entities. And if you look at who loses, right, when you allow for church to come into the state, it tends to be religious minorities and the non-religious more than others. And these days, by the way, it's also the wrong kind of Christian, which is really unfortunate, but it also allows us to reach more Christians who also are feeling, basically all of these public school lawsuits have not just Christians, but Christian clergy who are our plaintiffs because they're upset. They believe in non-ostentatious prayer and the Sermon on the Mount, and I've had to learn a little New Testament here. And they are very upset about the idea of one version of the Ten Commandments being imposed on their children. And also, public school teachers are not Sunday school teachers. And so, what will these teachers be teaching their kids? But still, I just still come back to the reality that we're talking primarily about Christians who are looking to preserve and protect Christian power in America.
Thank you. So Katherine, so from the sounds of it, Christian nationalism isn't new. And so we want to say more about how it started and is what we're experiencing today different from what we've seen in the past? Is it more or less extreme, for example?
Thank you. There have always been strains of reactionary religion and various iterations of Christian nationalist ideology that have come through to American history. But what we've seen is quite new because of the movement's political power. Since over the past, I would say that Christian nationalism in its current form really got its start in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when a group of folks who called themselves the New Right at that time, including people like Paul Weyrich, Phyllis Schlafly, Howard Phillips, and others, felt that the Republican Party had become too soft, too far to the left, too soft on communism. They were, some of the folks allied with this movement were very upset about school desegregation. In particular, some of the pastors with whom they were allied were running these segregated schools in the South, racially segregated religious schools, and the IRS was starting to kind of look at them and look askance. Rachel alluded to this sort of history in one of her earlier answers. And the IRS was starting to think, well, why are we, offering tax breaks for segregation? And this really upset them. They're also upset about a nascent gay rights movement, the women's rights movement. But, look, the ERA was going down in flames. They needed an issue to unite their movement, and they were allied with some ultra-conservative Catholic figures. And they thought about school prayer, and they thought, well, that tends to alienate the Catholics. We can't talk about, stop the tax on segregation because that would be such an ugly rallying cry. And they came to abortion as a unifying issue for their movement, and over time purged pro-choice voices from the Republican Party. But what they also did was they established these organizations like the Council for National Policy, which serves as a key networking organization for the doers and the donors, the sort of very, wealthy donors of the movement and the sort of leaders of the different pieces of organizational infrastructure. And they formed a Heritage and a whole bunch of other organizations. And over time, they began to really invest in this infrastructure. Now, in an earlier era, Republican leaders thought, wow, we can make great use of this movement. These people are going to vote for us reliably. They're not going to, vote for the other party. Where are they going to go? And they sort of would try to placate them, but they didn't recognize the power of the movement. I remember in 2011, George W. Bush's speechwriter said, oh, this is a movement that could fit into a phone booth. Well, I mean, in 2016, the phone booth moved into the White House. I mean, the fact is that that movement has really taken over the Republican Party, and the guardrails have fallen away. And they're now pretty much running the show. They're also allied with another key feature of the anti-democratic movement called the New Right. A lot of members of Trump's current administration, like Russell Vought, the director of Office of Management and Budget, and Michael Anton and others, are affiliated with this movement of the New Right. And I would say the New Right is less explicitly religious nationalist, like Russell Vought. self-identifies as a Christian nationalist and has sought to infuse the government with Christian nationalism in his other organizations. That's been sort of a stated goal of his some of his other organizations. But some of the new right figures, I would say, don't really fit within the Christian nationalist framework at all. Some of them seem quite atheistic and seem more inspired by figures associated with the Nazis, like the Nazi political theorist Carl Schmitt. I kid you not. But what they are is sort of less explicitly religious nationalist and more overtly anti-democratic. And a lot of the moves that we're seeing playing out in the administration today, the destruction of what they call the administrative state, which is the features of a functioning democracy. That is a real explicit new right agenda. But both sides of the anti-democratic reaction, the Christian nationalist movement and also the new right, I call them the power couple of American authoritarianism. They're really anti-democratic at their core. They involve, I would say, a rejection of a series of liberal democratic norms. They reject the legitimacy of the judiciary. They reject basically any like government agency or kind of government institution that they can't control. I mean, if we look at the attacks on Harvard and other institutions that we see today is a feature of authoritarianism. These are, the president is targeting this institution with illegal and unconstitutional methods to serve a really destructive agenda and really autocratic ends. It's really not just an attack on American strength. It's this idea that if he can't control, if he can't get this institution to bend to his will, it simply doesn't deserve to exist at all. And the fact that this is a fact that America's educational institutions have been such a source of our strength and security and made us the envy of the world, it doesn't matter to him at all.
Thank you. Rachel, continuing on the narrative, Americans United has repeatedly called out President Trump for advancing a Christian nationalist agenda. Do you want to offer some? You've mentioned there's some examples that have come up, but would you like to offer some examples that you see is happening in the current administration?
Sure, it's really hard to know where to begin, Matt. I will just give a list that is deficient, but I'll just get going. So he established something called the Anti-Christian Bias Task Force, which he is planning to use to reinforce this idea, this lie that religious freedom is really a license to discriminate and a workaround for our civil rights laws. And it's just pretty unbelievable that he would, say that it's Christians that are in need of the most protection when there is really so much anti-Semitism, right in his core cabinet. He established now the White House Faith Office. It used to be called, like under Obama, the Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships Office, and it was very careful to not violate the promise of church-state separation. But this office, he's removed faith-based and neighborhood partnerships. It's just the Faith Office, and he's appointed televangelist Paula White to be in charge of it. So like with the task force, the Anti-Christian Bias Task Force, he's really signaling these white Christian nationalist priorities. On National Day of Prayer, which unfortunately we have as a nation, and I'm not against prayer, but again, you shouldn't mix church and state. It protects religion as much as it protects religious freedom. We can come back to that one. But he announced the Religious Liberty Commission, and that commission is a who's who of Christian nationalist people. It's chaired by Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, who led the Texas Senate in passing legislation to end the teaching of critical race theory in public schools, abolish diversity, equity, and inclusion practices in universities, place In God We Trust in the Texas Senate, add Under God to the Texas State Pledge of Allegiance. The vice chair for the Religious Liberty Commission is Ben Carson, who was the secretary for HUD in the last Trump administration. On the commission is Kelly Shackelford, who's the president and CEO of First Liberty Institute. You know who they are, even if they're not ringing a bell. They, for example, were arguing in support of Coach Kennedy, the praying football coach who, for a public school, who pressured players to pray at the 50-yard line. Americans United was opposite First Liberty in that case, defending the school district. Kristen Wagner's on the board, on the advisory board for the commission. Kristen Wagner is the CEO and president of Alliance Defending Freedom, which is an organization that is misusing religious freedom to license discrimination, primarily against LGBTQ folks and women. Coming back to Trump, I'll just list a few more. He's supporting private school vouchers. Right now, there's an actual bill in Congress that would give $10 billion of taxpayer money nationwide to private school vouchers. And, there was just a study in Oklahoma that showed that the supermajority of people that were using vouchers were people at a very high income level already. And that's the way those go. There's lots of problems with vouchers from a church-state separation standpoint, though. First and foremost, they primarily fund religious schools. So fund taxpayer funding for religion through indirectly, as opposed to directly, which would have been the case if St. Isidore had come down the other way. And I'll just, he's ending the Department of Education. It's such a long list. He's taking back these faith-based regulation protections for people that are going to the government who are vulnerable and relying on services like food banks and domestic violence shelters and job training, elder care. But I just want to get to one last point, which is what he's doing, and Katherine was talking about this, what his administration is doing with the rule of law. He passed a rule to end all rules, it's called. The defunding of universities, the lack of due process, all of those things are the logical endpoint of Christian nationalism for this reason. For Christian nationalists to succeed, they actually have to take down democracy because they want special power and privilege for a few of us. And democracy is undergirded by equality. It's rooted in the promise of equality for all. So that's why, Christian nationalists were, out in droves at the insurrection, and I just want to pause and just say, I'm so proud of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism and like the Reconstructionist movement and the Central Conference of American Rabbis, the Union for Reform Judaism, because they put out such a beautiful statement. It was on how this coalition of Jewish organizations rejects the false choice between Jewish safety and democracy. And the point here, and this relates back to kind of Trump's Christian nationalism, and the point here is it's unsafe for Jews. And while they have a point that anti-Semitism is a real problem right now in this country and across the world, a huge problem, right? As is evidenced by so many things. And, very pointedly in my own backyard in DC, the murder of these two wonderful young people who were leaving this Jewish event, who work for the embassy. But this statement explains that the rule of law, right, all the things that the Trump administration Christian nationalists are taking away, the rule of law, freedom of inquiry, access to vibrant places of higher education, and strong democratic norms and institutions have allowed American Jewry to thrive for hundreds of years. And how so ultimately, this system of Christian nationalism and what Trump is doing by abolishing democratic norms is so dangerous for all of us, and certainly for Jews.
Yes, thank you. And I also wanted to say briefly that the Haberman Institute was signed on to that they
Oh, I love
one of the
that.
organizations that a number signed on to it. So
It was so well done, Matt. So well done.
yeah, it's definitely. Um, so Katherine, in your book, you delve into a number of the organizations and people and money that's working behind the scenes to advance Christian nationalism in politics. So if you want to say more about some of those major influences in the movement today.
Thanks. And I could point to some of the individuals or organizations leading the movement, but the point is that there are a whole bunch of different kinds of actors. There's no single power broker or single key organization. It's not about individual personalities. There are multiple key organizations and many, many key individuals. Some of the key groups are the activist organizations like the Faith and Freedom Coalition and Family Research Council, and of course, the legal advocacy groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom and First Liberty and Pacific Justice Institute play a really important role in pushing the agenda through the courts. Individuals who drive this movement include charismatic preachers and organizational leaders, and the movement's favorite, I would call him a pseudo-historian, David Barton, who has sort of crafted an alternate version of American history. And he's been discredited over and over by multiple historians, but the narrative that he paints is really too valuable to discard for movement leaders just because it's not true. And then, of course, one of the top brokers is Leonard Leo, who directs a lot of how the funding of the movement is allocated. Um, uh, and Christian nationalism is also, frankly, a fellow traveler with groups that are not explicitly Christian nationalists, but are critical in advancing the agenda, such as the Claremont Institute, Heritage, and the Federalist Society. Now, whether Sam Alito and Clarence Thomas are actually fully paid up members of the Christian nationalist movement, like this could be debated in detail, but they are actually instrumental in advancing its policies, and the courts are instrumental. I remember in advance of the 2016 election, and again, the 2020 election, went to a variety of conferences and strategy gatherings, and speakers would stand up and say, this election is about judges, judges, judges. And then they'd say, we don't need a Messiah because we already have a Messiah, Jesus Christ. What we need is a leader who's going to basically give us the judges that we want. So there's been a tremendous focus on the courts, and that's something that Americans United has been so cognizant of and meeting that challenge. Now, I would say certain politicians have also come to play a role. The paradox of Trump is that within the Christian nationalist movement, he has a status of a saint, or at least a divine messenger. Sometimes they refer to him as a biblical king, like a King Cyrus or a David. So that gives him tremendous power over the movement. And then we have other politicians like Ted Cruz or Josh Hawley or Tim Scott or Marsha Blackburn, to pick just a few. They often speak at these conferences and strategy gatherings, and they've managed to position themselves as icons of the movement. And then, of course, there are state governors and politicians like the governor of Louisiana, the head of the Oklahoma Department of Education, Ryan Walters, or Jason Rapert, former senator of Arkansas. Rachel, I know you're familiar with all of these folks. They play key roles in different features of the movement.
Thank you. So Rachel, what has Americans United experience been with some of these power brokers?
I mean, they are this shadow network that's worth like over $1 billion that we're fighting every day. And, Catherine's done such good work to expose sort of the money in this movement and shine light on the unreal funding that's being poured into this fight on the right. And by the way, they need the money, right? Like Leonard Leo needed to buy those seats on the court. I mean, because what they're championing is undemocratic and doesn't work for most of the people, right? I mean, I find it's dangerous to lump like whole religious denominations and identities together with Christian nationalism, but there's a, I think PRI's poll showed that something like 3/4 of white evangelicals are Christian nationalist adherents or supporters, adherents, or what is the word that he used? Adherents, or not skeptics, but
Sympathizers.
what is it, Catherine?
Sympathizers.
Sympathizers, that was it. And I mean, now I lost my point on that. Sorry, I got distracted by the lack of word. But I think what I was going to say is just coming back to your question, we fight these folks every single day, and that when we added up the annual revenue of every single friend of the court brief that came in against the Bremerton School District in the praying football coach case and the Kennedy v. Bremerton case, it totaled over $1 billion. And that's just from the groups that submitted the friend of the court briefs in that case, right? And then these same groups that were fighting, they pop up every single day in our fight. So the St. Isidore case is a great example, because we talked about how the Notre Dame Religious Liberty Clinic were the ones who defended in court St. Isidore, but at the same time Alliance Defending Freedom defended the virtual charter school board. And now who's, again, Alliance Defending Freedom? I said the group that is primarily misusing religious freedom to license discrimination against LGBTQ plus people and against women. They were the ones who brought the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, brought the 303 Creative case, both about fighting for the rights of businesses to discriminate against queer people in the name of religious freedom. And they also brought the Dobbs case that led to the overturning of Roe v. Wade, right? And then who represented Superintendent Ryan Walters, who Katherine Stewart was just talking about, the guy who Katherine and my friend Robbie Jones says is Christian nationalism in a tailored suit, or I like to say running for first place Christian nationalists in the country. First Liberty, the same outfit that defended the praying football coach. So, these folks, they turn up again and again, and they are unbelievably well funded. And I guess that's, that was the point that I was making before, which is just that it's true that three-quarters of white evangelicals are qualify as sympathizers or adherents, and that's a lot, but white evangelicals are only 14% of the population. And so and Orthodox Jews are who are kind of conspiring right now with that movement, or I think they're 10% of the 2%. So if you think about it, like, we're talking about a very small percentage, that's where I was going before, of the population that has very outsized power across America, and that are truly having to buy their power today as the demographics continue to change and the country tends to move. Now we're taking some steps back, but before, in these past 20 years, we've taken giant steps forward in attaining our promise of freedom and equality for all.
Thank you. The idea of buying power, I think, leads potentially into our next question for Katherine here. Your book title includes the phrase "movement to destroy American democracy," which is a strong statement, an alarming statement, I imagine, for many of us. Can you explain how you think Christian nationalism will destroy democracy?
The movement has put its faith and turned it worked hard to produce the current administration. And in terms of presidential overreach and corruption, we are in a situation without precedent at all. The Trump administration is consciously and willfully denying the legitimacy of the Constitution, the judiciary, or any law that places a limit on his power. And this is the most lawless administration in American history without exception. He moves the goalposts and he moves them again and he moves them again, breaking norms, breaking more norms until the goalposts are no longer even on the playing field. I mean, we've never seen anything to this degree. Now, there's been corruption in the past, of course, too. Think about Richard Nixon. Think about the Harding administration with its teapot dome scandal and so on. But no president in American history has organized pure upfront grift along the lines of Trump's meme coin scheme and dinners. No president has basically traded on the power of the office in such direct ways, accepting a $400 million palace in the sky from Qatar. Are you kidding me? No president has handed an Elon Musk type oligarch who profits from government contracts unaccountable and unconstitutional power to maraud through government, slashing and burning and destroying government functions that we need. So the combination of corruption and authoritarian overreach makes the present situation uniquely and exceptionally dangerous, and it would not have happened without the Christian nationalist movement's support for Trump. And think too about the betrayal of America's national security interests. This too is totally without precedent. We've had presidents pursue wrong-headed foreign policies in the past, but we've never had one who destroys alliances and aligns with adversaries in ways that can only be justified by his own self-interest. This is what the Christian nationalist movement has wrought. I mean, but Christian nationalism has always been anti-democratic. It takes the view that because America is a supposedly Christian nation, if you don't align with their agenda, if you don't conform to what they want, then you're an illegitimate political leader. So this kind of ideology, frankly, has made it very easy for these radicals to think that they were being the patriots, even as that they were, attacking the most basic institutions of our democracy, the Congress, the electoral process, even as they were like mounting a violent attack on our Capitol. So, it's really it's very anti-democratic at its core, and it's leading to the anti-democratic politics that we see today.
Thank you. Rachel, do you have any thoughts to share on what Katherine just shared with us?
So, I mean, Katherine appropriately painted a really dark picture of the havoc that Christian nationalism has wreaked on our country and really is in our world. But I guess I wanted to kind of take us to a more positive space from that, which is not hard because there's only one way to go from that. But the more positive space is that there really is an antidote to this. And that, Christian nationalists want to impose their religion on us all through the state, through government. And church-state separation is the antidote. It's what stops Christian nationalists from being able to codify their agenda into our laws if it's applied fairly. And so therefore, we all need to remember that we need to make church-state separation a real priority. Right now, when we look at like our donor numbers, we're like third or fourth or maybe fifth issue, but really it's church-state separation that is at the foundation of so many freedoms and rights that we value immensely in our daily lives, right? So if we value reproductive freedom, right, our freedom as Jews to make our own decisions about our own bodies according to our religious beliefs, right? If we value LGBTQ equality and believe that, in Jewish terms, we're all created in the image of God, right? If we believe in inclusive public schools that include our children, where our children will be welcome, and also other non-religious and religious minority and Christians that don't fit their form of Christianity, if we believe in democracy, all these things, then we believe in church-state separation, and it's time for a national recommitment to separate church and state in this country, which is an American original that we should be proud of. It's patriotic. I'm wearing my American flag pin before it's too late.
Thank you. Yes. And Katherine, do you have suggestions for how we can protect democracy? I see that I spied on the questions coming in, and I see a number of people have asked it. So, anything you have to share on that same topic?
Oh gosh, I mean, where do we start? There's, I too don't believe the situation is hopeless, although we are really facing some challenges and there are no guarantees. But I think that, listen, if there's will to do it, it can be done. I think there are things we can do as individuals, and there are things we can do when we join together with others. The last section of my book, Money, Lies, and God, has a whole, it's called The Way Forward, and I don't have time to summarize all of my recommendations, but I certainly have time to talk about a few of them. First, get out of bed. This is no time to hide under the coverage. This is really the time for moral courage. And I think, never underestimate what a single person can do. First of all, there's no substitute for turning out the vote, for the power of the vote. The movement knows this, and they represent a minority of the population, but they manage to turn out their votes in disproportionate numbers. But if those of us can recognize that we are in the majority, that is, more Americans believe that they want to live in a democracy than some sort of cronyistic, kleptocratic autocracy with theocratic features, then we can start to reach out to others, find common ground. We each of us have a sphere of influence, so don't just vote yourself. Get everybody in your friends and family groups to vote. If you're part of a faith communities or your sporting club or book club, just really hold your people in your sphere of influence accountable to vote, and help them understand why it matters. Help them understand what's really at stake here and to see the bigger picture. I think it's really also important to understand that we need a big tent. Those of us who are sort of support democracy and its institutions, we're a really diverse group of people. We're not going to agree on everything, and none of us are going to get everything we want, and we frankly probably shouldn't. But if we can agree on more than we disagree on, I think, to paraphrase a former president, the person who agrees with you 80% of the time is your 80% friend, not your 20% enemy. So we can agree on some of those fundamental democratic principles, then we can work together and form coalition. Another thing I think we need to keep in mind is that organizations really do matter. I mean, Americans United is doing such an amazing job of mobilizing its resources to sort of take on various court cases and strategize. They also have a program where they're helping to mentor young lawyers and help them understand what's at stake and strategies for combating the threat. But there are other organizations out there as well, and it's really important for the organizations, as Rachel has done a great job of trying to work in tandem with other organizations. I think there's plenty of money on when I say left, I'm going to say true conservative, moderate, liberal, progressive left, on that big sort of spectrum. There's plenty of money there too, but the right and the left spend their money differently. The right tends to invest in organizations and in individuals, so that they look for people with the supposedly correct ideological approach and invest their money in them, so that those, and a certain skill set, so that those folks know they can shore up their economic futures within the movement. And the left often invests in technocratic solutions, or in organizations that are working on maybe a single issue, but are working sort of in silo. And, if we're looking for organizations to support, it's really important to try and get the organizations to work with other organizations as well. And some are doing that. I'm starting to see a lot more collaboration than I saw even 5 years ago. And Rachel, I'm sure you'll agree with me. And that's really a real positive development. I mean, there's so much more to say, but I do want to say that as the current administration really starts hurting a lot of people as prices of goods and rise and businesses just become harder to run because of what those wokety wokesters at the Wall Street Journal called the dumbest trade war in history, as the sort of tariffs exact a price as people lose government services that they need and want and have paid for and deserve, as people lose their jobs, as they lose their health care, as our scientific establishment gets shredded. I mean, who would do this, as people start to really see the consequences of where this movement's actions have led us. I think we have a real opportunity to reach out to folks, even folks who may have kind of thought they were voting for something different, right? And say to those folks, well, here are the people who are sort of doing this to you, and here are some people who are fighting for you. So again, I don't think there are any guarantees, but we do have a chance. And I think if there is a will to get it done, we can get it done.
Thank you. I love the idea of a big tent. And so as we transition now between the more formal questions to the audience questions, and sort of the ideas that you both have just spoken about, one person asked about, is there a particular denomination within Christianity that's problematic? That has come up to some degree. I want to flip it also to ask what groups within Christianity or other groups are people that we can partner with, and maybe Rachel, you can start with some of the organizations that you work with, and then Katherine, if you have some ideas too.
Yeah, sure. There's so many. It's hard to know where to begin. I mean, for one, the mainline Christian groups, as they're called, as opposed to the born again Christian groups, many of those are with us in our lawsuits, with us in our sign-on letters. The Presbyterians, USA, the United Methodist Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, the United Church of Christ, Disciples. There's so many that we work with on a regular basis. Just earlier today, I was on a call with two United Church of Christ pastors in Oklahoma who are doing a lot of resistance work there on the ground and really leading it. Baptists, there's lots of Baptists that aren't Southern Baptists, cooperative Baptists, American Baptists that we work with every day. Actually, sitting with Katherine on our board are a Latino, white, and Black Baptist pastor, and an atheist advocate, and an Orthodox Jewish feminist leader, and many others. I do think it's really important to remember how many Christians are fighting on our side. I also wanted to just call out my friend Amanda Tyler, who runs the Baptist Joint Committee and started a wonderful program called Christians Against Christian Nationalism, which is just great and thriving. And the only and she's great about it, but in certain circles, when I've sort of been with folks who are in Christian circles fighting Christian nationalism, the only thing that I feel like I kind of say like a broken record is it's great and probably even more powerful to resist Christian nationalism from a place of your Christian values. I get that. Like when I speak in a synagogue, I speak in a lot of churches, I spoke in a mosque, but when I speak in a synagogue for this issue, I will quote, my favorite. I was going to end with it actually, Pirkei Avot quote, or which I hope to get in still tonight. And I get how persuasive leading from a place of your religious values can be, but I think it's particularly important for Christians who are fighting Christian nationalism to always remember to talk about church-state separation and our American promise of religious freedom for all, not just what's unchristian about Christian nationalism. So one form of Christianity never replaces another. Another person on our board is a Christian pastor. He's the vice chair of our board, Reverend Brian Kaler, and he wrote a book about how some of these seemingly harmless sort of civic, religious, sort of Christianity creeping into government under God. Well, we all, Jews and Christians and Muslims, everyone believes in God. How that actually laid a foundation for the Christian nationalism that we're seeing today. So I think it is so important for those Christians to remember that. But the most important point, Matt, in response to your question, is how many Christians are fighting with the non-religious and religious minorities to oppose Christian nationalism.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate hearing all those groups. And I actually studied at Emory and have many friends across Christian denominations who've these categories. Katherine, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, the first part of the question, touched on something that I think it is important to note. Religion is incredibly diverse. I've said it, I'll say it again. We have to really take that in. But there are certain, I would say, movements within the sort of, I would say there are certain religious movements that have actually lent support to a more anti-democratic agenda. I would say the sort of strain of theology that emerged from, during the time of slavery, frankly. Think about pro-slavery theologians like Robert Louis Dabney, James Henley Thornwell, who believed that America was established as an authentically Christian nation with hierarchies. This is really important. Hierarchies ordained of God, right? Racial hierarchies, gender hierarchies. And that strain of religion has sort of carried through. There's a sort of through line to, for example, a mid-century theologian named Rousas John Rushdoony, who's the father of Christian Reconstructionism, who also abhorred public education and chose to reprint in his publishing house, Chalcedon, some of the a pro-slavery theologian, and cited several of those pro-slavery theologians in his own very prolific writings, and sort of articulated some of this idea that these hierarchies are ordained of God, that public education is really terrible, that democracy is heresy, the heresy of democracy. And his words and ideas have been incredibly influential in the movement today and are adopted by many of today's, I would say, more reactionary theologians, even though they may not acknowledge the source and sometimes not even be aware. One person who is aware of the source, by the way, is David Barton, who's the most influential, I would say, historian of the Christian nationalist movement. He actually cited Rushdoony in he wrote like a sermon, or not a sermon, a sort of a paper or a chapter of a book or something on what he calls biblical slavery, which is, the way Rushdoony said it. Well, but slavery wasn't bad in the way that it was practiced in the Bible, but, because of man's sin, it was practiced imperfectly or whatever. So, but even today now there are like new movements. Like I'm thinking about a movement called the New Apostolic Reformation, which is emerged out of the sort of independent charismatic movement. Again, charismatic Christianity and Pentecostal Christianity are themselves like big picture, very diverse. But there's a sort of, I would say, section of those, that sort of broad movement that is explicitly anti-democratic, that sees spiritual warfare in the heavens playing out every day in the here and now in our national political theater. Many of the representatives of the New Apostolic Reformation say that, any opposition to Trump is literally demonic or satanic. And they endorse this idea called Seven Mountains Dominionism, which is the idea that Christians of a certain type, obviously, Not a Baptist Joint Committee or the Vote for the Good and those folks. Christians of a certain type should dominate the key features of government and society, which includes government, education, media, entertainment, and things like that. And that they, cast that as taking dominion back from Satan. So there's this idea that there's no neutrality. Anything that is not dominated by them is under the dominion of Satan. And the interesting thing about Seven Mountains Dominionism is it's such a kind of the language and style of sort of I would say certain this form of charismatic Christianity has sort of spilled over into areas of the movement that are not themselves remotely charismatic. So the Seven Mountains Dominionism framing has been adopted by other sectors of the movement.
Thank you. There's a question here, moving us to back to our current government, and if you could say, I'm not sure who would best address this one, so I'll leave it to both of you. But if you could please discuss Project 2025 with some examples and how it relates to Christian nationalism.
You want to start, Katherine?
Well, I'll just start, but I'm sure you could finish my sentences.
Probably.
Well, Project 2025, for those of you who don't know, is a 900 plus page document that was prepared in advance of the next, what they call conservative administration. It was basically prepared in preparation for the next Trump administration. It was coordinated by Heritage Foundation with the collaboration of over 100 other organizations. Different chapters were written by different contributors in advance of when Project 2025 sort of was, people sort of discovered it outside of the movement. Trump disavowed it. He said, "Oh, I have nothing to do with it. I don't know who she is, never heard of her," even though a large number of former members of his administration were writing chapters and contributing pieces to this document. And of course, many Project 2025 contributors have now taken up positions within the second Trump administration. And I would say just, it's a sort of marriage between the religious right and also the new right, and lays out sort of how these different features of government will be run or smashed to bits, depending on the case. Rachel?
Yeah. Okay, so I'll just pick up from there. If you think about some of the parts of Project 2025, you can see how the administration is following that playbook right now. LGBTQ equality, right? So Project 2025 makes a mockery of LGBTQ equality, and is into biblical marriage and all these things. And you can see from one of Trump's many executive orders, one where he erased transgender people. Just so upsetting, right? Just saying that you are the sex that you were born as. By the way, a religious definition came into this from conception, the executive order said, right? And the idea that life begins at conception, right? That's a Christian belief, right? That's not a Jewish belief, for example, or not every Jewish person's belief. I know there's a lot of arguing in Judaism, but that's not the by the numbers, that's not the average Jew's belief. Project 2025 talks about getting rid of the Department of Education. Well, the Trump administration has already made like a huge go at that. And, there's been an executive order. Project 2025 disparages diversity, equity, and inclusion. There have been executive orders that put back into place this 1776 commission, which is a Christian nationalist commission meant to sort of shape education according to the belief that, and this is part of their thing, that America's a Christian nation and everything else. So that sort of, he issued an executive order really that calls for sort of re-education camps along white Christian nationalist lines. So um, uh, um, one more example, Project 2025 redefines religious freedom as a license to discriminate. And if you think about the Trump Solicitor General arguing in support of St. Isidore, when I was in the courtroom, St. Isidore is a Catholic school, right, run by the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City and the Diocese of Oklahoma. And it says that it will discriminate against LGBTQ people and against women. It reserves the right to discriminate against kids with disabilities. I mean, and I'm talking in employment and in students and families. And that really is, and the argument was, I saw in the question, someone was referring to the Carson v. Macon case and just sort of this line. Now, again, the St. Isidore case was really different from the Carson v. Macon case because the Carson v. Macon case was about, sort of tuition assistance. It wasn't about direct and full public school funding, right? Public schools is a whole different realm from like tuition assistance and private school vouchers and everything else, right? But there is this sort of line that's gone through cases since a case called Trinity Lutheran, which is this idea that it's, and actually, and even Hobby Lobby, but that it's somehow discrimination against religion to separate church and state. So that, church state separation and religious freedom somehow is now unconstitutional because it stops religion from being funded the same way as non-religion, which is the whole point of church state separation. But again, that's an idea that is solidly embedded in Project 2025. So yeah, Trump distanced himself, like Katherine said, and then he's implementing the whole agenda and appointing people like Russ Vogt, who was one of the main authors of it, is the head of the Office of Management and Budget. I mean, he's appointing the folks from Project 2025 to his administration. There's a long list.
Thank you. We've had several questions about like what motivates others other than the sort of evangelical Christians, other non-white communities, for example. I'll throw in Jews also into the question to support Christian nationalism. One person noted a program that's titled "Is Trump Good for the Jews?" Just this idea. There's a number of Jews who support Trump, and again, I'll leave it to both of you. I don't who would like to take up this idea and question first.
I'll start if that's all right.
Sure, of course.
It really depends on which community you're talking about. And I mean, I will say something about the funders of the movement. Religiously, these folks are all over the place. So I'm thinking about people like Barry Side and Jeff Yass. I'm thinking about people like Sean Filer and the Corkeries. So Yass and Barry Side are Jewish. The Corkeries and Sean Filer are Catholic. I'm thinking about people like the DeVos family, members of the DeVos Prince family, or the folks sort of funding the Bradley Foundation, who are on balance evangelical. Thinking about even people who are atheistic, like think about Elon Musk and Anderson. So religiously, these folks are all over the place. Some of them, or think about people like the Wilkes brothers and Tim Dunn, these sort of energy billionaires. Some of these folks have religious and cultural goals, in part, and some of them don't, right? They seem to be motivated by nothing more than the desire to make more money and justify their wealth. The thing they have in common is that they feel like is frankly the economic stuff. They want policies, that not just are going to help them increase their wealth, like low taxes for the rich, minimal regulation for the environment, because a good number of them are involved in polluting businesses and in some form. They want no pesky regulations. At the same, a lot of them call themselves, pro-capitalist people. We just want to let the markets do their thing and work their magic. At the same time, some of them are looking for, protective policies for their monopolistic businesses. And they're also looking for taxpayer subsidies. I'm thinking about Elon Musk, who got billions in taxpayer subsidies. And of course, privileged government contracts. But sort of they're united not just in the sort of desire for those economic policies, but also I think there's a psychological justification. I think these folks are the, beneficiaries of huge ballooning concentrations of wealth at the very top of the economic ladder. Don't take it from me. Just look at the economic data, look at the economists and what they say about how we're in an era of really growing inequality, that's made life so much harder for so many American families to succeed. And the folks at the very top, I think they feel a little bit defensive about that, right? They want to believe they earned every single penny with their bare hands, but they can hear their critics sort of from far over the walls of privilege saying, wait a second, maybe you should pay your taxes. Maybe you should actually pay as many taxes as a school teacher, or maybe you should pay your employees better. And they don't like that. So they're really drawn to the sort of ideology that tells them that they justify, not just they can grow their wealth, but the wealth is justified. And the thinkers of the movement, the sort of intellectual cadre of the anti-democratic movement, play a really important role. People like Leonard Leo, I call them funder whisperers. They sort of tell the funders how to spend their money on this anti-democratic movement. So that is one way in which people who are not themselves white evangelical Christians, for instance, might be drawn to support the movement. And then, of course, there are different strategies when it comes to different sectors of the rank and file. One of the reasons that we've seen such a shift in the Latino vote over the last 8 years, although it appears to be shifting back now with this sort of grotesque, targeting of people who sometimes are actually American citizens and they just are Latino, so they're getting stopped and in some cases like detained, etc. But there has been a massive shift in Latino vote between 2016 and 2020. There was an 8 to 10 point shift in the Latino vote overall, and an even greater shift, even more points in between 2020 and 2024. And part of the reason is that movement leaders know that if they stay just all white evangelical, they're going to lose because the country is diversifying. So they've made a real substantial effort to draw Latino conservative pastors into networks like Ministros Hispanos is one, and there's various, in different locations. Often they're connected to large, I would say, policy and advocacy groups like Faith and Freedom Coalition. And they have these gatherings, I've been to a couple of them, where they, again, draw these pastors into a church somewhere and they give them their speakers, and then they give them tools for turning out their congregations to vote for their biblical candidates. And often they'll do this. The messaging relies on lies. They're spreading lies about what's happening in the public schools. They're, telling these folks that, the public schools or libraries are filled with pornography and all this kind of nonsense. And they get people really sort of worked up. And so that there's been a very, I would say, substantial outreach to different communities of all different types. I mean, that's something the movement is very good at doing. They tailor messaging to different groups that they want to draw into their coalition. And again, certainly it appears that Trump support among Latino Americans is eroding. So that's kind of interesting. And again, it points to the fact that I think sometimes people might cast their vote for some of these culture war issues because they really want to, they don't want, pornography in the public school library, which there isn't. But they end up getting policies that may not agree with at all.
Thank you. Rachel, did you want to add? I see you.
Me too. I mean, I'm also just cognizant of the time, but I mean, I can just say really quickly, I'll just give two examples. I mean, I think that sometimes minority groups are multifaceted in their identities. So Jews are Jewish, but many Jews, not all, are white. there are a lot of Black Christians who are, minority in their Blackness and majority in their Christianity. And sometimes there's safety in sort of leaning into the identity that's in power. I would also just say for Jews, I think there's some, confusion over the mixture of philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism happening, out of this administration. I mean, I think the I just want to acknowledge for a moment, forgive me for being controversial in some circles, there's a lot of anti-Semitism on the left right now. And I think, there's a reaction against that as well. And that's legit. Like, that is real too, is what I'm trying to say. But I would say, here I would just remind Jews that Trump has dined with Nick Fuentes, the head of the Proud Boys, with Kanye West. I just would remind Jews of the Root and Ram couple that I told them about earlier, and that the Oklahoma charter school operator, that we don't win actually in this regime at all. And then I just was struck by this historian, Jamar Tisby, who's a Black Christian who spoke at our Summit for Religious Freedom that we ran recently. And, there are so many stories across history of Black people appealing to people in the government in America as Christians to end slavery and end racism. And so that has worked for Black liberation, and also that the Black church is so much, and I've heard a lot of Black Christians criticize facets of it too, but it's also it's a church of liberation. And so it's not sort of a negative, it's a strong positive in that community. And sometimes I think that can make this more complex, but it to me, it shouldn't be complex because, again, like Jewish people and like all Americans, actually, including white Christians who want America to exist, that none of us win as we're sort of seeing now when Christian nationalists lead.
Thank you. As we come to a close, I want to say that let everybody out there know that there's so many more questions that we wouldn't get to, and I know some of them are in Katherine's book if anybody's interested in, and we're happy to include in our follow-up any materials from Americans United or from you, Katherine, to the audience to help answer their questions. I want to give you each a chance to close sort of as a potential guiding question. You can use it or not. This one question here: given the growing influence of Christian nationalism, what can we realistically do to protect our democracy? Can we rely on the courts to check the Trump administration's overreach? Or should we be focusing on more ultra-local action, like pushing back against school boards advancing religious curricula, such as LifeWise? You can take that question or end however you want to leave us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Rachel or Katherine, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, there's no shortage of avenues for engagement. Local action matters, joining organizations, getting out the vote. We have elections in less than a year and a half, so the time to act is now. And I want to thank all of you for joining together today for this really important conversation.
Thanks, Katherine. What an honor to do this with you. And thank you so much for your work. And you can start by buying Katherine's books, and she's written many. But I would say these things. Number one, please join Americans United. We need you. We're up against $1 billion shadow network. And we've grown our annual revenue, but we need to grow it even much bigger. So au.org. Number two, speak out and tell your stories as Jews. Like speaking authentically and making yourself vulnerable and explaining why church-state separation is so important to you and your family and your people is powerful. So tell your stories. 3, reach across divides, like Katherine said earlier, right? We can unite around this issue in such divided times, horribly divided, dangerously divided times. Church-state separation is an issue that can unite us, and religious freedom and fighting Christian nationalism. So reach out, don't just do the pulpit exchange for Dr. King's anniversary, do it around this. you can find common cause with Muslims around this. There's a lot of reaching out to a lot of folks on this. And finally, I'll just conclude because I had to get it in with Pirkei Avot. Maybe that'd be a nice way to end. The ethics of our fathers. Probably some of you know what I'm about to say, but hope is a practice. And Katherine said earlier, get out of bed. But you can't get out of bed if you don't have hope. And we have to engage in the practice of hope and believe that this country can get back on the right track so that we can get out there and exercise this moral courage and act. So I will leave you with words that give me hope every day from Pirkei Avot, and they are, it is not your responsibility to complete the task, but nor are you free to desist from it. So go fight, everyone, for what you care for, and don't just fight. Call people in, because we need to work together right now more than ever. Thank you so much for being here. To the Institute, Matt, to you and your wonderful team, and to everyone who's given so much of their time tonight to this fight. Thank you.
Yes, thank you both so much. It's really been wonderful, and that was a beautiful note to end on. And I appreciate your wisdom and expertise in tackling all these questions. It's really been a great evening. So take care and have a great rest of your evening. And
Bye,
thank you all
everyone.
for joining
Join
us.
AU, au.org. Bye.
Definitely. Bye.